I remember that day clearly. It was a sunny Tuesday when I was about to meet Mark's parents for the first time. I was nervous but excited. Mark and I had been dating for 2 years, and he had finally popped the question. I had heard a lot about his parents, but we'd never met. Mark had always described his parents as traditional and a bit old-fashioned. I guess I didn't realize what that meant until I met them. We decided to meet at a local cafe. I arrived first, wearing my favorite blue dress, hoping to make a good impression. Mark arrived with his parents. His mom, Mrs. Thompson, wore a stern look and his dad, Mr. Thompson, seemed uninterested in everything around him. "Kate, these are my parents, John and Margaret Thompson," Mark introduced us. "Nice to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," I said with a smile. "Likewise," Mrs. Thompson replied, scanning me from head to toe. "Mark tells us you're a lawyer. Where do you work?" I was taken aback by her directness but managed to reply, "At Johnson and Partners, downtown." "And your salary? Must be good, being a lawyer and all," Mr. Thompson chimed in, his tone blunt. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's adequate for my needs," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "And where do you plan to live after the wedding?" I glanced at Mark, hoping he'd step in, but he just shrugged. "We're still discussing that," I said. "And your parents, what do they do?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice almost demanding. "They run a small business," I replied, growing uncomfortable with the interrogation. Mrs. Thompson snorted. "Small business, huh? Let's hope they can contribute decently to the wedding." I felt a knot in my stomach. Mark noticed my discomfort but said nothing. As we ordered, Mrs. Thompson kept making side comments about the prices, and Mr. Thompson kept nodding in agreement. The whole meeting felt more like a business transaction than a family gathering. I remember thinking, is this what my future looks like? I tried to shrug off the feeling, telling myself it was just first meeting jitters. But deep down, I knew this was a red flag I couldn't ignore. It didn't take long after that first meeting for Mark's parents to become a constant, unsettling presence in my life. Their calls would come at any hour, disrupting my daily routine. Each ring of the phone started to feel like an intrusion. One evening, just as I was about to leave my office, my phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Thompson. "Kate, dear, I need you to look over some legal papers for us." "It's just a small favor," she said, her voice laced with expectation. I sighed, feeling the weight of her request. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm actually just heading out from work. Can it wait?" "Oh, it's just a quick look." "You can do it, can't you? For family," she pressed. I agreed reluctantly, knowing this was becoming a pattern. The next day, Mr. Thompson called. "Kate, I need help with setting up a new TV. Mark's busy, can you swing by?" Their requests were becoming more frequent and more demanding. I tried talking to Mark about it. "Mark, your parents are calling me all the time. For legal advice, for tech support, for everything," I said, hoping he'd understand. "They're just being friendly, Kate." "They're like that with everyone," Mark replied casually, brushing off my concerns. "But it's too much. They're calling me at work, at odd hours." "I'm feeling overwhelmed," I insisted. "Come on, Kate. They're harmless. Just trying to bond with you," he said, not meeting my eyes. I felt a mix of frustration and helplessness. It was as if Mark was completely blind to his parents' overbearing behavior. One evening, as we were having dinner at my place, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, again. "Kate, can you come over tomorrow? I need some advice on redecorating the living room." "You have such good taste," she said. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm not really an interior designer." I started, but she cut me off. "But you have such a lovely home. I insist." "We'll have lunch," she said, making it sound more like a command than a request. I hung up, feeling trapped. Mark just shrugged and said, "See? They really like you." But to me, it felt more like they were taking advantage of me, and Mark's indifference was only making it worse. I started to wonder if this was what my future with Mark would be like, constantly being at the beck and call of his parents, with no support from him. It was a Friday evening when Mark suggested we go out for dinner with his parents. He chose a fancy restaurant downtown, the kind where you'd think twice before checking the prices on the menu. I had a hunch it wouldn't be a casual, relaxing dinner, and boy, was I right. We arrived at the restaurant, and the Thompsons were already there, scanning the menu. Mrs. Thompson's eyes lit up when she saw the lobster and steak options. "Kate, you simply must try the lobster here. It's divine!" Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. I glanced at the menu and saw the price. It was more than I wanted to spend, but before I could respond, Mr. Thompson chimed in. "Mark told us you're doing well at your firm. Surely, a successful lawyer like you can afford a little splurge now and then," he said, his tone a bit too pointed. Feeling cornered, I smiled weakly and said, "Actually, I was thinking of something lighter, maybe a salad." Mrs. Thompson looked at me as if I had suggested something outrageous. "A salad? Nonsense, you're at one of the best restaurants in town. You must try their specialties." I felt uncomfortable, but decided not to argue. I didn't want to cause a scene. As we were eating, the conversation revolved around Mark and his achievements, with his parents occasionally throwing in a question or two about my work, but not really listening to my answers. Then came the moment of truth, the bill. Mr. Thompson patted his pockets and then looked at his wife with a feigned expression of surprise. "Oh dear, I think I left my wallet at home," he said, his voice a little too calm for someone who'd just dined lavishly on someone else's dime. Mrs. Thompson joined in the charade. "John, how could you be so forgetful? I don't have mine either." I looked at Mark, expecting him to step in, but he just shrugged and mumbled, "I guess I forgot my card too." I couldn't believe it. Were they serious? It was clear this wasn't just forgetfulness. It felt more like a setup. With a sinking feeling, I pulled out my card and handed it to the waiter. Mrs. Thompson smiled sweetly at me. "Thank you, dear. You're such a lifesaver." As we left the restaurant, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Was I just a walking wallet to them? And why didn't Mark say anything? With the wedding drawing nearer, it became increasingly clear that it was time for our parents to meet. Given all my experiences with Mark's parents, I was bracing myself for this encounter. I remember pacing in my living room, phone in hand, rehearsing how I'd break the news to my parents. I finally mustered the courage and called them. "Hey, Mom, Dad, I think it's time you met Mark's parents," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, Kate, we've been so excited about this. When can we meet them?" Mom's voice was a mix of enthusiasm and curiosity. I took a deep breath before adding a cautious note. "Just to give you a heads up, they're a bit, well, intense." Dad's voice came through with a chuckle. "Kate, we've seen all sorts in our days. Don't you worry, we'll manage." His confidence was comforting, but I couldn't shake off my apprehensions. We decided the Grandview Hotel, known for its pleasant ambience and beautiful surroundings. It was a familiar place to me, which I hoped would provide a distraction if things got too intense. The next day, I mentioned the plan to Mark over breakfast. "So, we're meeting at the Grandview Hotel this Saturday. I think it'll be nice for our parents to meet in a neutral, relaxed setting." Mark nodded, absorbed in his phone. "Sure, sounds good. I'll let my folks know." I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of preparation. I wanted to ensure that everything was perfect, hoping it would help keep the peace. As the day grew closer, my nerves began to fray. I found myself obsessing over every little detail, from what I would wear to how I would steer the conversation away from any potentially sensitive topics. On the eve of the meeting, I lay awake, scenarios running through my head. What if Mark's parents said something offensive? What if my parents didn't like them? What if the whole lunch turned into a disaster?